In the heat of an ordinary afternoon, when the city smelled of fried dough and hot metal and people moved like they carried debts in their pockets, a black town car eased to a stop beside the bus shelter, and suddenly the crowd around it seemed to inhale all at once. Lucas was there, 16 then, carrying a cardboard tray of iced coffee sachets, the soles of his shoes thin as leaves and his shirt clinging to his back from sweat. His hands knew the flat weight of coins and the sting of being overlooked. The window rolled down and a woman looked out, not merely pretty, but precise, with a jaw set like carved stone and a voice that cut clean through the market noise. "Come here." He stepped forward because he had nothing to lose. She took off her sunglasses and her eyes were like polished coal. She smiled and placed a folded envelope in his palm, as if passing along something ordinary. A small fortune in clean bills and an invitation that sounded like rescue. Why would a woman like that give him anything at all? He had never felt anyone look at him like she did, as if he belonged to some future she was designing. That day, his life moved from scavenging to sitting at a lacquered table, and he did not yet understand which things had been bought. Lucas had learned need as a language before he learned verbs. He grew in a narrow room above a bakery where the morning heat came through the tin roof and the bread dust settled like a promise he could not afford. His mother had left when he was 8, her name Rosa kept in the way the neighbors lowered their voices. His father Miguel worked 2 shifts fixing engines and came home with grease on his hands and apologies in his pockets. Rosa, the sister, was younger than him by 3 years and had a laugh that could unstick a stuck window, and she kept their small apartment from becoming a cave of silence. Lucas learned to trade favors for food by the time he was 10, learned which alley had the kindest shopkeeper and which bus driver would take pity for a story. He learned the taste of boiled cassava in the rainy season and the cold, sugared air of festival nights when he had to watch from the curb. School felt like a distant country. He left at 15 to work full-time so Rosa could stay. The smells of his childhood were strong. The yeast of the bakery, the metal tang of the repair shop, the herbal steam from Donna Maris, the neighborhood healer whose potions smelled of cinnamon and rue. He kept a photograph of his mother, folded in a book, edges worn to transparency, and the photo was a small altar he touched before sleeping. When the car stopped that market afternoon and the woman reached out, Lucas recognized the shape of a promise he had been taught to accept early, because acceptance had saved them before. He also knew that promises carried weight. He had seen them bend people into shapes they did not expect. The woman introduced herself in the car as Victoria Quint, pronounced with slow vowels and a precision that made Lucas's name roll oddly in his mouth. Her voice was quiet enough to demand more attention than any shout. Around them the market hummed, a bus hissed, someone called a child's name, a dog barked, the smell of frying oil mixed with dust and the citrus of a nearby fruit stand. "You work hard," she said. "I can help." He blinked. "Why me?" "Because you look like someone who can still be remade," she replied. Her offer came with a card stamped in gold and a small list of conditions written in ink that smelled faintly of almonds. There were others watching, men with pressed uniforms and faces like set masks, and Helena, the woman who cleaned Victoria's offices, stepped forward and smiled at Lucas the way a cat inspects a new piece of furniture. "We will house you," Victoria said. "We will teach you. You will not be alone." Miguel, who had come to the market with him and who still believed there was honor to being offered a hand up, felt the air change and muttered, "Take it, son." Lucas heard gasps and the click of a camera as a tourist captured the moment. His hands felt the envelope of money again, and he tasted metal at the back of his throat. He said yes because Rosa needed new shoes, and because the sound of that luxury called to a part of him that had only known the opposite. He said yes and stepped into a car that smelled of lemon oil and old perfume. In the weeks after, small things unfolded like petals with sharp edges. The mansion Victoria kept sat behind a high wall, its gate a black mouth that opened with a polite sigh. The first nights, Lucas tasted white tablecloths and water that did not feel like it came from a tap that sneezed. He learned the names of people who moved inside those rooms. Paulo, a broad guard with a soft voice who watched the pattern of footsteps like sheet music. Helena, who taught him how to fold napkins and how to polish silver until it stung his eyes. Dr. Alvarez, a man in a gray suit who arranged papers and spoke in the soft language of donations and trusts. Detective Ortiz, who would later appear with a badge and questions Lucas could not have imagined. Donna Maris, who smelled of sage and would be the bridge between what they feared and what they could do. There were favors, and then favors for favors, dinners where a cigar left a bitter line on the palate, and a room assigned to him that looked like someone who had never had to count breaths. The servants said she did this for those who had potential displayed on the faces of people like Lucas, as if poverty were a talent show. The neighborhood murmured. Miguel watched with a steady jaw. Rosa packed a small bag and kissed Lucas on the forehead. Victoria called him Lucas, and sometimes, when she laughed, her voice filled the corners of the house and left no shadows. When people asked what he had done to merit such fortune, Victoria answered with a story that sounded as tidy as a bow. "I saw you in the market, and I imagined you better," she'd say, fingers resting on the arm of a chair like a delicate instrument. Around her there were photographs threaded on the walls, family poses where she looked smaller than the rooms she filled. Portraits of ancestors with names Lucas had to learn. At parties, she introduced him as someone she had rescued, and he learned a new posture under the chandelier light. Yet, there were rules whispered in the hallway. No going beyond the koi pond after dusk. Do not open the far cupboard in the study. Never enter the room that smelled faintly of old books and smoke. The staff moved with a careful economy around those rules. One evening, curiosity pricking like a splinter, Lucas asked Paulo about the locked door, and Paulo lowered his voice. "Some doors are for keeping, and some for not knowing," Paulo said. "Lady Victoria pays well for the keeping." The answer landed like a stone in Lucas's gut. He felt a hum of unease, and tasted the lemon oil from the car as if it had been poison all along. There came a night when a sound unlike the others pulled at Lucas from sleep. He rose and walked the marble corridor barefoot. The cool under his soles was a sharp contrast to the humid press of the city outside. In the study, the light was under the slant of a lamp. Dust motes like tiny planets orbiting. Victoria's desk was a terrain of papers and an old photograph of a woman with closed eyes. Lucas's hand hesitated on the brass knob of the forbidden door, and the metal was cool, with a faint scent of coal. He looked back and imagined Rosa's laugh, Miguel's grease smudged on his knuckles, Donna Maris's hands stirring a pot of remedy. He turned the knob. The door opened into a room that smelled of resin and candle wax. There were objects arranged with the careful cruelty of an altar, a photograph trimmed of edges, a length of red cloth, small jars with powders that looked like ground bones, and a little box with an inscription Lucas could not read. On a table lay a ledger with names and dates, and his breath caught at the sight of a recent entry that carried a town name he recognized. He heard footsteps and almost did not have time. Hide behind a curtain before Victoria stood at the doorway, her silhouette a cutout in the lamplight. "You found what you should not have," she said, and she did not raise her voice. Her calm made a new ache inside him. The investigation that followed unspooled like a thread tugged from a tapestry. Lucas confronted her that night in the parlor. The conversation became a small war of sentences where each word shifted power. "Why did you bring me here?" he asked, and his voice shook. "To save you," Victoria replied with a steadiness that made his skin prickle. "To give you a chance." "There are names in that ledger," he said, and he slid the book across the table. "They are towns like mine," he continued, "people who disappeared." "They were lost before my family found them," she said. "You think charity has no cost? Everything costs something." "What cost?" Lucas demanded. "An offering," she said, in a tone as if she were describing a recipe. "A way to keep balance." He felt the air thicken. He tried to summon Miguel's logic, Rosa's laughter, Don Amadis's steely practicality. "You used me to hide it," he accused. "I used you to save you," she answered. The exchange continued until the room felt like a place where all the mirrors had been removed and only reflection itself remained. Voices rose outside, the clink of silver, the distant television in the servants' quarters, the city breathing like a tired animal. Lucas left that night with a weight in his chest and a resolve that had the shape of a plan. Moment of tension 1 came when Lucas and Miguel tried to retrieve the ledger from a locked drawer and found Paulo, waiting with eyes like coals and a palm that did not tremble. The room smelled of lemon oil and dust, sounds absorbed into the thick curtains. Miguel whispered, "We take it, we run." Paulo's hand rested on his holster, though he made no move. His voice was soft. "You do not understand the size of what you touch." Lucas remembered Don Amadis's stories of bargains signed with blood, and he felt dizzy. The exchange that followed was a careful dance of words and threats, and Miguel's face grew old in a single breath. They left empty-handed, but the ledger's shadow followed them like a promise you cannot ignore. Moment of tension 2 happened at the pond when Rosa came to visit, and Victoria appeared with 2 candelabras and a smile that did not reach her eyes. The night smelled of lilies and rain on stone. Rosa reached for Lucas, and Victoria's hand blocked her gently, an iron glove. "He owes me nothing," Rosa said, cheek bright with indignation. Victoria tilted her head. "He owes himself safety," she answered. The exchange was a knife in the air. A guard lingered too close, and Lucas felt trapped between gratitude and disgust. The pond reflected a moon that seemed to watch them like a witness that could not speak. Rosa left with hurt folded into her pockets, and Lucas understood that his choice had fractured small things that had once been whole. Moment of tension 3 was a solitary hour when Lucas crept into the study to photograph the ledger pages with a small phone, his fingers trembling, his breath loud as a drum. The house settled like a beast. The only sounds were the distant hum of air conditioning and the tick of a clock. He saw names repeated, dates, rituals described with an order that read like bookkeeping. A photo of a child with a missing toe, a name scrawled in a hand that shook, an address he'd known as a shortcut to the baker. The room reeked of resin and a bitter spice. When he left the shadows of the room, he almost ran into Dr. Alvarez, who was returning paper. Their exchange was a brief, loaded collision of minds. "Be careful," Alvarez said. "You are not the only one who has woken to a secret." Lucas swallowed and walked away into a corridor where the lights hummed, and his skin felt too thin for the world. At this point, when the ledger was no longer an abstract rumor, but a set of images on his phone, the video pauses, and we want to ask you something, because this is the moment many of us imagine in our lives. What would you do if a powerful person offered to change everything you knew in exchange for silence about what you discover? If you would walk away, start your response with "I would walk away." And if you would stay to fight from the inside, start your response with "I would stay to fight." The community here reads every comment, and your words matter to people who have to decide between a warm room and a waking conscience. Tell us in the comments what you think Lucas should have done, and why. Your answers help others feel less alone, and they shape episodes we will explore next. Now watch what happened when he decided to use both paths. Lucas began to look for allies. Donna Maris became his secret counsel. She smelled of boiled herbs and old pamphlets and listened without blinking when he poured out the ledger images. "Power is a river that can drown you," she said, setting a cup of bitter tea between them. "You must learn where the current is strongest." She taught him the names of certain charms and told him where to find them in the market and which words to use when a lock did not want to open. Detective Ortiz, who had come by officially to ask about missing persons, showed a crack of curiosity mixed with discouragement. "These houses have lawyers with maps," Ortiz said. "They translate fear into silence." He passed Lucas a small card with a number and the suggestion that not everything required a badge. Dr. Alvarez, whose philanthropy had always struck Lucas as an arrangement of neat rows, quietly handed over contact details for a small NGO that documented abuses. Helena, the housekeeper, whispered warnings and slid small notes under Lucas's door like breadcrumbs. Each ally gave him a piece of something, a word, a contact, hope. In these interactions, the dialogue stretched into long negotiations and late-night planning sessions, with patience worn by hunger replaced by the kind of patience that plans rescue. The plan grew like a map of both courage and risk. They decided to interrupt a ritual that Victoria performed monthly in the locked room, a ceremony she kept in candlelight and with an audience of a few carefully chosen patrons. Paulo's pattern revealed the hours hands shifted, and Dr. Alvarez offered legal pressure, though he admitted his options were limited. Dona Maris prepared a charm, a small bundle of herbs and a folded lenço scented with rue, that would, she promised, make the air inside feel thin, a momentary distraction that would allow Lucas to move. Miguel would wait by the gate with the car, Rosa would call the number of a local journalist who owed them a favor, and Detective Ortiz would arrive with a claim that might force a pause. Lucas rehearsed answers and kept his phone charged in his pocket. His palms sweated, and at night he woke with the metallic taste of fear. The night of the confrontation, the mansion smelled of beeswax, and the collared guests carried the cool perfume of money. The ritual room glowed, candeas flickered, and the altar held a photo of a child from a town Lucas knew. Victoria's voice rose and fell in a cadence that was both public sermon and private accounting. "We give," she intoned, her voice threaded with calm. Lucas stepped forward as the charm, tucked in his sleeve, warmed like a small animal. He had rehearsed what he might say, and he had planned to shout the ledger names, to throw the physical proof onto the table and demand answers. When he moved, his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. There were exchanges, a long-drawn combat of sentences with Victoria and her patrons, where each retort lacerated and each silence weighed. "You came to judge me," Victoria said gently. "You came to punish me," Lucas answered. The charm was thrown like a stone into the circle, and the air changed. A bitter smoke rose, and some guests coughed, others sat rigid. In the confusion, Detective Ortiz pushed in, and Dr. Alvarez held a camera up, live for an investigator. Paulo did not move fast enough to block the doorway, and Helena's face crumpled as she realized the direction of her loyalty. The ledger was produced, pages spread like wounds. For a moment, everything suspended, the scent of burned herbs, the crack of a candle snuffing, the echo of a child's name called out into a room that had no right to hold such things. Victoria did not scream. She tilted her head and told them, as if reading a lineage, the story of why the ritual existed, an old debt, an agreement her family had made generations ago in a drought, a dark bargain whispered by an ancestor who promised prosperity at a price. She spoke of sacrificial language as if it were bookkeeping, of souls as entries to be balanced, and of a necessity she had learned to soothe herself with. She walked them through the ledger names and the reasons, each explanation like removing a bandage slowly. Her confession was a revelation and a seduction. It asked for empathy even as it set a scale where lives were weights. Lucas felt rage and a heavy compassion at once. When she mentioned one name that he recognized as someone who had vanished from the street near his school, he saw Miguel flinch. "We kept families alive," Victoria said. "We kept the city functioning." "At what cost?" Lucas asked, and the room breathed. The climax was not a blaze, but a careful dismantling. Public exposure dissolved some of the moneyed patronage. Detective Ortiz filed papers, and photographs were uploaded and sent to a small news desk that had little reach but a steady conscience. A few of Victoria's allies departed as the air smelled of scandal. Victoria's face, once a mask of control, finally cracked into something like fear. She was human in that moment, tired and mortal. The altar was torn down by hands that had once polished it, the jars emptied into the garden like a strange compost, and Dona Maris performed a counter-ritual, not to curse, but to cleanse, uttering words that sounded old and practical. The ledger was turned over to authorities who were slow and imperfect, but at least present. Victoria was arrested on charges that spoke to human trafficking and ritual abuse and a million smaller things that made the headlines. Lucas watched as the power around him unspooled. The mansion walls still stood, but felt thinner, like paper brought near light. He had thought breaking the system would be a single moment of fury. It was quieter, more exhausting, and required alliances that smelled of compromise. The aftermath did not resolve everything. Some people who had been named could not be found. Some families bore the cost of publicity and retaliation. A few donors quietly paid for damages and then vanished. Lucas and his family faced public scrutiny along with support. Yet slowly there were constructive outcomes. An NGO run by Dr. Alvarez and two others began a program offering room and job training to youth from Lucas's neighborhood. Rosa received a small grant to open a bakery, and Miguel was offered a repair apprenticeship that paid a living wage. Dona Maris ran free clinics where she taught herbal remedies and, more importantly, how to recognize coercive offers. Paulo agreed to testimony that revealed a pattern of control. Detective Ortiz continued to push cases and sometimes failed, but never stopped returning to the files. The mansion became a site of investigation and later of reparation hearings. Lucas enrolled in a vocational course and, for the first time in his life, felt a future that required waiting instead of constant scrambling. Epilogue 1 month later found Lucas keyed into routines that tasted of normalcy and cautious optimism. He walked past the market with new shoes, and the dust on the street looked less like a sentence and more like the residue of things already changing. He visited Rosa at the bakery and learned to knead dough under her laughter. He kept a photograph of Victoria's ledger page folded in a pocket as a reminder of how fragile safety can be. The community presented small dinners where people shared food and fear in equal measure. Lucas's face in the neighborhood no longer belonged to someone invisible. He had a presence that could carry weight without breaking. Epilogue 3 months later showed more concrete shifts. The NGO had opened a community center named after a neighborhood teacher who had believed in the kids. Miguel had a stable shift and could repair more than engines. He fixed bicycles for kids who could not afford a bus. Rosa's bakery served as a meeting place for young people to learn baking and budgeting. Detective Ortiz had started a small program within the police department to protect whistleblowers, imperfect as it was. Lucas was learning to speak at community events and found that his voice, once choked by hunger, could steady a crowd. He did not romanticize the changes. He knew how many things still needed fixing, but the ledger that had once been a list of hidden debts had become a catalyst for conversation and action. Epilogue 6 months later had Lucas looking at a small list of projects he wanted to begin. He joined with Dr. Alvarez and Dona Maris to start workshops on consent and power, and Rosa expanded the bakery into a training space. They built a small scholarship fund financed by local donors who had been embarrassed into conscience, and the money paid for tools and courses for young people who might otherwise have been lured by easier promises. There were still nights Lucas woke with the scent of resin and lemon oil in his mouth, and he sometimes caught himself imagining the ledger as a book that might open again. But he had also learned to place a photo into a drawer, not to forget, but to make room. He sat by the gate one evening and watched children chase each other in the street, shoes slapping a rhythm that sounded like life moving forward. He folded a small lenso and placed it in a jar on his shelf, a token not of superstition, but of survival and memory. In a city that had always balanced on cracks, something had shifted toward repair. If you feel moved by Lucas's choice, consider sharing this story. And talking about what choices we make when power offers us easy rescue. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and join a community that believes in telling difficult truths and building practical answers.